Hi, I'm Deb Geyer with the Quilters Hall of Fame. On September 28th of 2020, we will open a new exhibit here at the Quilters Hall of Fame that comes to us from the American Quilt Study Group. The exhibit is called 200 Years of Solid Color Quilts, 1800 to 2000. I have with me today Dale Drake, one of the artists with a quilt in the exhibit. The name of her quilt is Crown Flowers for Queen Lili'uokalani. Hi Dale, welcome.
Deb, good to see you.
Dale's quilt is a traditional Hawaiian quilt, correct?
Yes, it is. Hawaiian quilts are generally solid color, two-color quilts. They look very much like a snowflake cutout. They would have 8-fold symmetry to them, and they have they include lots of flowers and leaves. They're very botanical usually.
And so tell us the long history behind your love of Hawaiian quilts.
I grew up in the Navy, and my father was stationed in Hawaii. We went there in 1958, came home in 1961. We were there when Hawaii became a state. And
oh, that's exciting.
I know. And I was, between the ages of 8 and 11. Military children don't generally know what home is. You know, if you ask me, you know, where do I come from, I would have difficulty in saying, except I come from the Navy. But all of our ports that we stayed at usually add something, you know, to us. And I've always had a real fondness for anything Hawaiian. And I've gone back once, and I hope to go back again.
Great. And so when did you pick up your love of quilting and applique?
I started quilting fairly late. I started in 1992. I'd done a lot of other hand things in the 70s and 80s, knitting and crocheting and needlepoint, all those things. But I started quilting in 1992, and I quickly found out that I loved applique, needle turn applique, and I loved anything sewn by hand. I do sew quilts by machine, but I really, really enjoy just the relaxing sewing by hand. And I love needle turn applique. And so there's always been this idea in the back of my mind, boy, someday I'd like to make a Hawaiian quilt. But Hawaiian quilts are usually bed quilts. They're very large. And there's a lot of quilting that goes, there's a lot of applique first, and then after this entire pattern is appliqued on this bed-sized quilt, then there's echo quilting that goes all around every shape. So in addition to hand applique, you have a lot of hand quilting. So I never have gotten around to making my bed quilt.
What led you then to do this one quilt for the exhibit?
In addition to falling in love with hand sewing, I've always been interested in history, and so I discovered that you could actually study the history of old quilts. That was really exciting. And around 2004, I joined the Quilters Hall of Fame and also the American Quilt Study Group, which is the national organization of quilt history researchers. That's an organization that, well, we study quilts. And we have a seminar every year in a different part of the country. So we get to learn about, say, Pennsylvania quilts or Connecticut quilts or whatever, you know, wherever we are, we learn about those quilts. That's the annual seminar. In addition, AQSG sponsors a quilt study challenge every other year. And that challenge is on a theme of one kind or another. The first one that I participated in, red and green quilts. Quilts with the red and green applique tradition. That's a 19th century tradition. That was the first one that I did. There was stars, quilts with stars, quilts with baskets. And I've participated in about 6 of these. And you have 2 years to work on your quilt. And what you do is, for whatever the topic is, you find a heritage quilt, an old quilt that you would then interpret in a wall hanging size, no bigger than 42 by 42. Those are the rules. And then you interpret the quilt. You can make a copy of it, a small copy. You can just take pieces of it. You can interpret it in whatever way you'd like. So that's the quilt studies, and I have participated in those, like I said, for about 12 years now. They have 50 entries in each challenge, and then 25 are chosen for a traveling exhibit that travels around the country, and the quilts travel from museum to museum, maybe big quilt shows, and they're exhibited for 4 years in various places. So that's why my quilt, with all the other quilts for the 200 years of solid fabric quilt study, that's why it's now at the Quilters Hall of Fame. When you go to seminar, there are talks and there are small sessions that talk about a different topic. And there are also something called poster presentations, where someone puts together some thoughts in a poster, similar to other like scientific posters. I was at seminar and I saw a poster presentation on royalty symbols in Hawaiian quilts.
Yeah.
I knew that Hawaiian quilts had some certain rules to them. They don't use figures of animals or anything living. They don't use people. They generally use flowers. They're usually botanical, but they also use these royalty symbols, and I didn't know about that. The Hawaiian nation in the 1800s developed a lot of symbols that were meaningful for their royal family. And so this paper talked about these royalty symbols in quilts. And I was very excited because I didn't know anything about this. And I filed that away in my head. Then fast forward to a few years later, when the 200 years of solid fabric challenge came up. Now, normally in one of these challenges, you are given a time period. One time it was Civil War era quilts, and that's what you had to do. Something that would have been made in the Civil War era, or the 19th century, or the colonial revival time period, which is when Marie Webster was making her beautiful quilts. This one was much more general, 200 years of solid color. And the other phrase with it talked about regional and cultural differences. So then you had to think about, well, what regional or cultural group of quilts solid colors? Hawaiian quilts today can be made with anything, but Hawaiian quilts traditionally were made with solid fabrics. Originally, on my inspiration quilt, which we'll be talking about, it's a white background with red fabric. And I did read when I started studying these, that originally the missionary women brought fabric, but they generally had big bolts of white fabric, and they also had big bolts of turkey red fabric. So the colors. So a lot of the first quilts were red on white or white on red. Mm-hmm. They did bring other fabrics, but the Hawaiian women really took to this idea of making a quilt with this applique and making this large symmetrical pattern with flowers and everything, and they developed that. The missionary women did not come and say, "Here, let's make a quilt with eightfold symmetry and flowers." They came and they were trying to teach patchwork quilting, and that kind of thing. And also sewing with fabric, because the native Hawaiians didn't have cotton fabrics. Yeah. They had some kind of fabric made out of bark, but they didn't have cotton fabrics. So the missionaries are trying to instill sewing skills. Yeah. And also teaching them how to make quilts, which is interesting because it's such a warm climate. Why do they need quilts? They made quilts and they developed their own particular style of quilting, this echo quilting that goes around. It looks very much like an ocean wave type thing, and that may be why the topic came up. 200 years, regional and cultural differences, solid fabrics, and I said, well, I am going to make a Hawaiian quilt, royalty symbols. I'm so excited. So that's what I did. And to do that, I started studying. I read everything I could about Hawaiian quilts, and that's actually quite a bit. And I brought a couple of books. This is the classic. It's Hawaiian Quilts by Stella Jones. This was published in 1973. Most of the information, people still agree, is it's accurate. There have been lots of other books. There's this little book about the quilts in Kauai, the Wilcox quilts in Hawaii. Yes, we're gonna put lists of these books because these are really interesting. So I read a lot about Hawaiian quilts and how they made them, and I learned about that red and white fabric choice that we learned about. I learned about the different kinds of royalty quilts that were made, of which there were quite a few. One of them is a red and white one. This is a classic Hawaiian quilt with royalty symbols. It has 4 big, looks like feather dusters. They were Kahili, and they were the royal standards that were held over the royalty when they were on their thrones. They were made out of feathers. They could be 15 feet tall. They were quite dramatic, and they were usually red feathers. And then, so those 4 kahilis. Then these are little crowns also.
Okay.
And then there's ornamentation around that is more botanical. And this quilt also had echo quilting. It's actually a very famous design. It was in a quilt exhibit on Kauai, on the island of Kauai in 1933, and we have pictures of it in that exhibit. They believe it was given to Mother Rice, who was the wife of one of the original missionaries, given to her by Native Hawaiian women. Mother Rice founded Punahou School in Honolulu. You may have heard of Punahou School because that's where Barack Obama went to high school. So anyway, it's a fairly famous quilt, and I decided to use that. The quilt is at the Honolulu Museum of Art, and one of the things that you have to do, you have to actually have a specific quilt that you base your own quilt on, and you have to get permission to use that image. So I had to contact the Honolulu Museum of Art and get permission to use this image in AQSG publications, along with my quilt. So that was step number 1, was making sure that I could get permission to use the quilt. So I had a quilt, and I knew pretty much what I wanted to do. What I wanted to take the images, the different images from that quilt. One of the traditions in quilting is that, in Hawaiian quilting, is that you do not just copy somebody else's quilt. You may use it as inspiration, but in some way you make it your own. You change things around, or you take this out, or you make this bigger, or in some way you make it your own. So that's what I did for my quilt. I had never designed a Hawaiian quilt before, and so I went looking, and I discovered that the Pacific Rim Quilt Company in Seattle has published the book, Design Your Hawaiian Quilt. It's written by Janice Lee Bayer and Nancy Lee Chong, and this is perfect. It was exactly what I needed. It tells you all of the it basically demystifies the steps of how to design your own quilt. How you choose the style that you want, choose the little elements that you want, and then start playing with it. And you start cutting things up in paper, because you make a paper pattern, and you play around with paper until you have something that you like. Here's my pattern that actually is the center of the quilt and one of the leaves. So, and this is my pattern for
the border.
Site.
So,
So
the AQSG quilts all have a size limit, right?
They do. A maximum of 42 by 42.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that way you didn't have to do a huge bed quilt.
I didn't have to do an entire bed quilt. No, this was enough work.
Yes.
It was enough work.
I bet.
But I loved every step of it. So the quilt's very colorful, which I'm sure you know. I chose the colors red and gold because those are royalty colors. They are basically based on the feather capes that the kings and queens would wear. They were made out of red feathers and gold feathers. And so my quilt is made out of in red and gold. I took the Kahili idea, and in the original quilt, the 4 kahilis are crossed in the middle of the quilt, and I decided instead that I would put 8 kahilis around the outside, 4 big ones in the corners and 4 little ones on the north, south, east, west axes to symbolize the 8 Hawaiian islands. There are 4 big Hawaiian islands and 4 small Hawaiian islands. So my kahili represent the Hawaiian Islands. I did keep the crown from the original quilt, and that's this little piece right here. That's only half of it. You have to see that it flips. I kept that in the center. I really liked that image, but I added a very graceful leaf frond. And these are melee leaves, M-E-I-L-E, melee leaves. And melee leaf lays are the traditional circles that go around you like a necklace made out of flowers. Mm-hmm. Melee lays were given to royalty. It was a symbol that they wore. And it's a very fragrant leaf that they use. Oh. So I incorporated melee leaves. I also incorporated crown flowers. It's a particular kind of flower that was a favorite of the last queen, the last ruler of the Hawaiian Islands, Queen Lili'uokalani. And this is the half symbol of a crown flower. She really liked crown flowers. So I wanted to put crown flowers in. She was the last Hawaiian ruler. I read her story. It's a very tragic story. She was imprisoned when the Americans were trying to take over the islands. She was imprisoned. She's imprisoned in her own palace. And in one of the quilts that I was looking at when I was looking at books, I found this image going around the edge of a Hawaiian quilt. These are based on the spikes on the gates of Iolani Palace. So I put that around the edges because this is Queen Lili'uokalani's quilt, and it symbolizes, her imprisonment there. So I took all those symbols and I basically designed a quilt. And then all I had to do was sew a long time.
That's all.
A really long time.
How long did you work on it? Did it take you the full 2 years?
Oh, no. No, I'm never organized enough to start. Of course not. No, I thought about it for a year.
Okay.
Yeah. So I had to turn it in at seminar, which is always in the fall. So it's the fall of 2018. I had to turn it in then. I started it around January. I did the design around Christmas of 2017, 2018. I do remember that I took it with me. We did some traveling, and the quilt went with me wherever I went. I was appliquing it. First, you have to cut this big thing out because if you look at my quilt, it starts out as a big piece of red and a big piece of gold, and then you cut out the red, but that's one piece of fabric that is inches, around, and with all of the elements. So you don't piece those pieces in. It's all one piece of fabric. So
that's amazing.
That was a challenge, and then getting it all laid out and basted. And then once it's basted, boy, you can just take it with you wherever you want to. So that was good because wherever I went,
yeah.
and I worked on it. And then, of course, after you applicate it, then you have to quilt it. One thing that I did do is this quilt has wool batting in it. I've been playing around with wool batting, and there are pros and cons to it. But traditionally, they used wool batting because they didn't have cotton. They didn't grow cotton in the islands. They had sheep. The missionaries brought sheep, and sheep, did really well in the islands. And so they had wool for batting. So I put wool batting in the quilt.
Oh, good. Good.
Yeah.
It's a lovely, lovely piece.
Thank you.
I thank you for taking the time to talk to us about it. Was there?
Wonderful. Thank you for asking me about it.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add?
I just hope that when people see it, that they will maybe learn a little bit about Hawaiian history, or maybe be inspired to go learn some more about Hawaiian history and Queen Lili'uokalani.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Dale.
All right. Thank you.